The following program is an original production of WYCC PBS Chicago.
A rare apology from the mayor. Rahm Emanuel says he's sorry for the police shooting that's led the U.S. Attorney General to launch a sweeping investigation of the entire police department. But the protests and calls for the mayor's resignation keep coming. Can Rahm Emanuel repair the damage? And give me shelter. Here in Chicago, more homeless teens are on the streets. We meet one who bucked the odds to get back on her feet. These stories and much more tonight on In the Loop. Good evening. I'm Chris Bury. This is another tense and historic week in Chicago. The Justice Department has launched a major investigation of the police department. That announcement came even as officials released more controversial videos of police using deadly force. And amid growing pressure, Mayor Rahm Emanuel apologized for the police shooting of 17-year-old Laquan McDonald in a speech to the city council.
What happened on October 20th, 2014 should never have happened.
During his unprecedented speech to aldermen, Mayor Emanuel said Chicago is facing a defining moment on crime and policing. He said the city needs to make a painful but honest reckoning of what went wrong and begin the healing process.
The first step in that journey is my step, and I'm sorry.
The mayor got emotional when he talked about how young black men he met with say they are treated differently by police than he would be treated.
That has to come to an end, and end now. No citizen is a second-class citizen in the city of Chicago.
Even as the mayor spoke, angry protesters filled the streets from City Hall to Michigan Avenue. Some were calling on Mayor Emanuel to resign.
Mayor Emanuel should resign because he has lied, did a murder cover-up, and basically he's not doing the job he's supposed to do.
The protests flared up again as officials released more videos of police using deadly force. In one dashcam video, police officer George Hernandez is seen leaping out of his unmarked car, shooting and killing 25-year-old Ronald Johnson after a chase on the South Side in October 2014. But Cook County State's Attorney Anita Alvarez says the shooting is justified because she says Johnson had a gun and was approaching a police car.
No criminal charges will be filed against Officer Hernandez in connection with the shooting death of Ronald Johnson.
Johnson's mother is not satisfied with that outcome, citing her attorney's claim that police planted a gun at the crime scene.
I want that case reopened, and I want him charged with murder.
That case comes on the heels of the police dashcam video showing a white officer gunning down 17-year-old Laquan McDonald. That touched off massive protests, prompted the firing of Police Superintendent Gary McCarthy, and led U.S. Attorney Loretta Lynch to take a hard look at the Chicago Police Department.
I'm here to announce that the Department of Justice has opened an investigation into whether the Chicago Police Department has engaged in a pattern or practice of violations of the Constitution or federal law.
That investigation is expected to begin early next year. After first calling such an inquiry misguided, Mayor Emanuel now says he welcomes the federal oversight and he acknowledges the police department needs reform.
Supervision and leadership in the police department and the oversight agencies that were in place failed, and that has to change.
Emanuel has already begun by removing senior police officials. He's also replaced the chief of the Independent Police Review Authority, the agency that examines police shootings, with former federal prosecutor Sharon Fairley.
I promise you, I bring no agenda other than the pursuit of integrity and transparency in the work that IPRA does.
The mayor's approval rating is now near an all-time low of just 18%, according to one recent poll. Some community activists, including Charlene Carruthers, national director of the Black Youth Project 100, are calling on Emanuel and Alvarez to resign.
They showed a gross inability to be compassionate and to make the right decisions in the face of a police officer killing or taking the life of a young black person.
Mayor Emanuel and State's Attorney Alvarez insist they have no intentions of resigning. Now joining us are Charles Thomas, political reporter for ABC7 Chicago, Tom Serafin, founder and CEO of Serafin and Associates, and Hal Dardick, reporter for the Chicago Tribune. Welcome, everyone. And Charles, you were there yesterday. What did you make of the mayor's speech?
Well, I don't know what he was apologizing for. That was the part of it that was so unclear to me. We know he didn't shoot Laquan McDonald, so obviously he was apologizing for something that happened during the past 13 months or 13 months before the public saw that video. You know, we have to wonder about, let's say it's your job. You're on your job and you commit some egregious act that costs your company millions of dollars. And without explaining your motivation for being involved in that egregious act, you say to your boss, "Hey boss, I apologize, I'm sorry." And the boss looks at you and says, "I accept your apology, but you're still fired." I don't think Rahm Emanuel gets that still fired part and why people are demanding his resignation.
Tom, you do a lot of crisis consulting for other clients. For Emanuel, is this a necessary and critical first step, this apology, this public apology?
It is, but it has to come along with transparency on the activity before, during, and now what's going to go next. What's the plan as we go forward? And where have we been, as Charles says? The apology, it's like, you know, apologizing to your wife for coming in late, but she's going to ask you, where have you been for the last 12 hours? So, you know, you have to be prepared to answer those questions. And as soon as you do, you put that behind you. As long as you can't put it behind you, you become part of the daily discourse. As you see, they're not going to resign. Nobody's going to resign here. But in order to affect change, you have to be able to tell people where you've been in order to tell people where you're going.
Hal, you're at City Hall every single day. Has this crisis rattled Rahm Emanuel like no other?
Oh, clearly it has. He's had the crisis with the budget, but that was nothing compared to this. And what's been interesting about it is how during the course of this he keeps reversing himself. So the Rahm Emanuel, who everyone thinks of as this great political operative, has found himself reeling and reacting rather than being proactive and getting out ahead of this. At first he said that this was an isolated incident. And now he says that there's a code of silence in the police department and that it's endemic among a minority of police officers, but something that has to be addressed. At first he said that we don't need a federal investigation.
He called it misguided.
He said misguided was the term that he used. And within 24 hours he was saying, I welcome.
What changed his mind?
Probably Hillary Clinton coming out and saying that there should be a federal investigation, someone he supports for the presidency of the United States, and who is an ally of his, and he found himself on the losing side of this battle. He may have known it was coming, too, and you may as well join him if you can't beat him. And he also said that McCarthy, his former police chief now, Gary McCarthy, was handling things fine, and he didn't need to go, and then he got rid of McCarthy, and he got rid of the person that heads up the Independent Police Review Authority, which investigates.
So many fits and starts during this crisis.
Correct.
And to his, not to his defense, but to his defense, he's always been the man behind the curtain. He's always been part of the Bill Clinton White House when Arafat came in and they had the handshake. He's always arranged things, always made things happen from behind. He's never been the principal, never been out front.
Well, he's been mayor for 4 years now.
But he's never had this kind of crisis. So you can't be both. You can't be behind, you can't be at the table and also at the podium. And that's where the struggle has been. I think that's where the confusion is for him.
Charles, in this speech, the mayor was very specific about the culture of the police department needing to change. He talked about the thin blue line and the code of silence. What can Emanuel do to change that culture?
Good question, because keep in mind that Mayor Daley in 2007 went through the same exercise after that bartender was seen, or after the bartender was beaten by the off-duty cop. That's when they formed the Independent Police Review Authority that was supposed to handle these situations, that was supposed to mete out justice to police officers who committed misconduct. Didn't happen. I didn't hear anything that the mayor said yesterday, other than a framework, specifically to deal with some of these problems. Now, he appointed this task force to address the issues, but keep in mind that the task force, which is supposedly going to have its work completed by March, the federal inquiry, this patterns and practices inquiry, is much bigger, and it's going to recommend the same thing. So these are only going to be stopgap measures at best that the mayor's task force recommends. The feds are the ones that are going to actually, by consent decree, make recommendations where they are necessary.
Well, one way that you can break this culture or change this culture at City Hall is to end the code of silence. And the way to end the code of silence that they've tried to do in other cities and been somewhat effective is to fire cops who lie about what their colleagues are doing. And in this case, where the video shows Laquan McDonald being repeatedly shot after he's walking away from the officer, and all the other police reports back that up, you need to fire those officers who perhaps lied about this incident. And the mayor's talking about it. Interestingly, though, and you talk about these reports that are out there, the SAFER report, late last year.
Former Assistant U.S. Attorney.
That's right, and it was a report that the mayor had commissioned, and it recommended a lot of things to deal with this code of silence. And one of them was you need to start firing officers and intervening sooner, like in the case of Officer Van Dyke, who shot this young man. And none of that happened. So the recommendations are out there. You can study this all you want. You got to start walking the walk.
But Hal, think about what a mess this is. The guy who signed off on those field reports from that night in October 2014 is the interim superintendent, John Escalante. He was the chief of detectives then, who signed off on all these fictitious, or what apparently are fictitious reports filed by those other officers on the scene that night. What a mess.
Yeah, there was a really uncomfortable moment at City Hall this week when he was asked about that, Superintendent Escalante.
And he said it wasn't his job to sign off on
That's
those.
right. He said, I don't sign off on those. We're changing that now. Well, that's kind of interesting. You're in charge of the
This
detectives.
apology, rare though it was at City Hall, did not seem to satisfy the protesters. And Tom, they're still calling on Mayor Emanuel to resign. Is he going anywhere?
No, he's not going to go anywhere. And he's looking up at 2019. And at one time, he thought he was going to be running for re-election. I don't know what his plans are right now. But the police department issue is a systemic issue. But the culture in City Hall is systemic. And it goes back decades. And other people that were mayor are responsible. And Mayor Emanuel has done a job trying to avoid pointing the finger at previous administrations, the Daley administration and others, for creating the situation he finds himself in. He can't be one of the guys. He can't be like it always has been. Things have to change. And when you talk about the police department, they want to hire 2,000 more cops. Well, what kind of training are they getting as they move into the process? The first thing you do in a crisis situation is start fresh and clean. What kind of training are they getting? And is this culture of, keeping your mouth shut when you see something obviously inaccurate or wrong? What are you doing to step up, and how do you reward them? The City Hall has had a hard time with FOIAs. They've had a hard time releasing information, even though the mayor says, I'm for an open information
system. So that
system.
code of silence extends from the police department all the way to City Hall.
I mean, Charles, hell, cover it. They see it every day. They fight for information.
Yeah, and I don't think there's any doubt that there's been a cover-up. Now, who was involved and why they were motivated to be involved, but the fact that we haven't been getting information is a cover-up, that we're not allowed to see it. Even now, they're fighting the release of this Chapman video. They're fighting it. So why are they fighting it? Because they don't want someone to see it? In some ways, that's a definition of cover-up.
And even though the protesters are calling for the resignation, and you suggest it's not going to happen, even if it could happen, is there any mechanism for it, Hal?
There is no mechanism for it currently at City Hall. There was a bill introduced in the General Assembly yesterday by LaShawn Ford that would allow for a recall of a mayor. The chances of that passing a democratically controlled legislature are somewhere between 0 and 0, I would say. But I don't think that's going to happen. The city council could also pass an ordinance that would allow for a recall mechanism. And as we know, this mayor has so far strongly controlled that city council. That's unlikely to happen. The question too is if you did resign, what would happen? Well, for a while you'd have to pick one of the aldermen to lead the city council. Who is in a position to do that?
The same problem they
You
had
gotta
after Harold's situation was, I think it was David Orr. You have to have somebody there ready to take that seat. Protesters and everybody's calling for a resignation. Well, what if the resignation came tomorrow? Well,
Yeah.
you know, so you know, in your situation like this, you have to prepare for the next step. That step has to be there, and you present a plausible succession process. Then that. You talk about resignation might work, but nobody's going to resign over this. He's a fighter. He's always been a fighter on something like this.
I was just going to say, Charles, this is not in his political makeup, his DNA.
It's not in his political makeup, but there's a wild card out here, and that's the fact that the people who are out there in the street right now are young. They are under 30.
The next generation.
The next generation. We've seen a next generation of protesters. In fact, there's a story going on out there now that Jesse Jackson, with the microphone, and they took it away from him. Yeah. And man, well, how symbolic that is. Yeah. And I don't know what this new generation of protesters, of protest, is going to mean. I mean, they have different ideas about what should happen and how it should happen. And the fact that they are engaged, these young African-American protesters, is a beautiful thing.
Many of their demands have already been met. The police chief is gone, and now the U.S. attorney has announced a sweeping civil rights investigation. Charles, you were there. You went to Washington to hear Loretta Lynch make the announcement. What's your sense of what it's going to look like over the next year or two?
I think that, you know, she was very, very, she approached this very gingerly. She didn't want to mention anybody's name.
Measured.
Very measured. But the way I understand it, if this team, this Justice Department civil rights team, sees things, and they see something that may have happened years ago that has some criminal possibilities, they will refer that to the Northern District, then go back to their general inquiry. So there is a possibility of things, because keep in mind, this is the city that brought you police torture. This is the city that has been in wrongful, that is basically the national leader in wrongful conviction.
And this has been an issue for decades.
For decades. This is not happening in a vacuum. But this inquiry is only aimed at resolving or changing patterns and practices. That inquiry. But what they find could end up in the Northern District as a criminal case if they find something that is particularly
then they have to have the will to prosecute. And historically in this town, the will to prosecute has been low-hanging fruit. Obvious people like Blagojevich and Alderman, 30 or 40 over 50 years. I mean, it's very hard to go after the big fish who are real big fish.
I think the feds haven't necessarily been afraid of that as much as the local prosecutors have. And I think what you have to remember is the feds move at a glacial pace. Takes them forever to do anything. They're still investigating the Laquan McDonald shooting 13 months later and whether anyone else should be charged in that incident. And what will happen in this case is the mayor will try to get out way in front of this and try to start walking the walk, as I mentioned earlier. And it'll depend on how well he does that and whether these protests die down and what kind of changes he makes. He's got to stop talking and start doing.
The next thing he has to do is choose a new police superintendent. And what kind of criteria, Charles, you want to start, what kind of criteria do you think that the city needs right now for a new police chief?
Oh, boy. That's a tough one. I think that, politically speaking, the next superintendent of police in Chicago is going to be an African American. I think that politically, that's got to be a move that the mayor makes. Keep in mind that he got into some political hot water when the prior superintendent, McCarthy, appointed Escalante, the chief deputy, or the first deputy, and an African-American, Al Weisinker, who retired, gave the job up. I mean, that caused an uproar at City Hall. In fact, the Black Caucus at that point called for McCarthy to resign because it was a mess.
So besides being an African-American, Tom, what other criteria?
I'd like to see somebody from the city. somebody who understands the culture, understands what needs to get done. I'd like to see somebody under 40 years old, somebody aggressive, progressive, to do the job. I think when you bring somebody else from outside the city, outside the state, you have a pretty good learning curve there. I think somebody needs to be systemically aware of what's going on. I'd like to see somebody locally on that force. And I don't think it needs to be a Chicago cop.
Hal, you want to add into that?
I think you need someone with real reform credentials, someone that can come in. Mayor Richard J. Daley appointed someone back in the 60s who lasted for 7 years, and he did make some actual changes at the time, but he had to bring him in, the top reform guy in the country. You need someone that's committed to that, and the mayor needs to get out of the way and let them do it.
We just have a few seconds left, so we're going to do a quick lightning round. Does Rahm Emanuel survive the crisis? Very quickly from each of you. Charles?
I don't know if he can survive it to be reelected as mayor.
I think he survives it.
I think he survives it, but how well he survives it and whether he has the political capital at the end of it to run for mayor again remains to be seen.
On that note, thank you all very much. We appreciate it. Thanks to our guests, Charles Thomas, Tom Seraphin, and Hal Dardick. The number of young people going homeless in Chicago is on the rise. Tonight, Robin Robinson joins us with her report on teens in Chicago who try to survive on the streets.
Some startling numbers here from the Chicago Coalition for the Homeless. This year, around 125,000 people were considered homeless at some point in Chicago. About 9%, or 11,000, are homeless youth, and their numbers are growing. They can be hard to spot. They sometimes are spending nights on the couch at a friend's house or at a shelter. But hundreds are sleeping out in the open tonight, in a park or an alley. They work hard to hide their situation. They're hungry, scared, and doing the best they can.
The misery, the pain, the stress, the struggle, it's nonetheless real, and it's really painful, but it's like you're by yourself.
Monica Townsend sits on a park bench on Chicago's North Side, reflecting on the years she spent being homeless.
I mean, I'm here alone. I don't have anybody. Your family leaves you.
Despite being alone and homeless, Monica kept pushing forward, carrying a full load of classes at Malcolm X College on the city's west side. At the end of the school day, she would take the long journey north on public transportation to settle in for the night at a park where she felt relatively safe.
So like around 4 or 5 o'clock I would ride here, just do homework or just think or write even, or just watch kids and families run around.
As day turned to night, sleep was elusive, maybe 4 hours total, always staying half awake, she says, wary of her surroundings. Monica is classified as an unaccompanied youth, according to the Chicago Coalition for the Homeless, young people aged 14 to 21 who are not living with an adult. The coalition estimates more than 11,000 people like Monica are in Chicago, making up about 9% of the total homeless population. And it says their numbers are growing. Sol Flores is executive director of La Casa Norte, a nonprofit group that works with homeless people of all ages.
I've never met a person, a young person in particular, that has chosen homelessness.
In her 13 years on the job, Flores says she's seen the number of homeless youth increase every year. The U.S. Department of Health and Human Services says more than half report being kicked out of the house by their parents. 46% have been physically or sexually abused.
The young people who show up at our programs and at programs across the city are trying to escape homelessness and violence.
With youth homelessness at alarming levels, 19 social service agencies organized Sleep Out Chicago to raise money and awareness.
I grew up on the South Side, and I was a homeless youth.
On a night like this, a homeless teenager has very few places to go for safety and shelter. So maybe it's fitting that it's a night like this when hundreds turned out to sleep out in the open to show just how hard it can be on the homeless.
To be honest, I was restless. Like, I couldn't sleep at night because, like, you know, the worry of, like, my safety, where I was going to sleep at, like, if it's going to rain that day, if it's going to be cold, or, you know.
A young man named Angel, who didn't want to reveal his identity, turned out for Sleep Out Chicago at Montrose Harbor. 19-year-old Marcy Vaughn recalls trying to blend in.
What does a homeless person look like? Because I was homeless for about 1 or 2 years, still going to high school, yet no one recognized that I was homeless. Everyone thought that I'm still stable, living with my parents and everything else, but outside of school doors, I'm outside on the streets.
For many young people, their sexual orientation leads to homelessness. 40% of homeless youth identify themselves as LGBTQ. 19-year-old Marcia Wilson says she had to choose between living as a biological male or expressing her preferred identity as a woman and living on the streets.
As a homeless trans woman, I was often sexualized. People would often assume either I was on the street prostituting or I was on the street, just trying to steal.
Marcia has often found safety at night at a place called The Crib. The Lakeview shelter offers sleeping mats, basic necessities, and a place to clean up. But there's only room for 21 people per night. If more show up, there's a lottery. Those who don't get in are offered a bus ride to an adult shelter. Mayor Emanuel has launched an ambitious program to end homelessness called Chicago's Plan 2.0. Military veterans have priority, but it recognizes the problem of homeless young people for the very first time. This year's budget included $1.2 million for more shelter beds, which are in short supply. The city has more than 2,000 emergency shelter beds available each night, nearly 4,000 transitional housing beds, and about 8,400 beds in permanent supportive housing. Not nearly enough beds, and beds are not enough to solve the problem. Monica has found a way out of her homelessness. She is currently living in an apartment provided by La Casa Norte under its Youth in College program.
I never thought I would have something like this, ever. This is actually truly a blessing.
As long as she attends school full-time and keeps her grades up, she can stay in this apartment. Monica says that program provides the stability she was missing.
To be here, it's truly amazing. It's a great feeling to know that you're coming to a home and coming somewhere that you can call your own.
That, of course, is the kind of outcome that advocates would like to see happen with more services provided to homeless youth, Chris.
We hear that a lot of homeless people don't want to go to the shelters for whatever reason. Is that also true of kids?
It is more true of young people. Those thousands of shelter beds that we mentioned, less than 400 are specifically designed to hold young people. Young people don't want to be, nor should they be, in shelters with older, sometimes more entrenched or so-called chronically homeless people. There are a variety of dangers that they face, and they would rather sleep in a park than in a shelter, worried about their safety because it's not meant for someone their age.
You talk about some 11,000 homeless kids who are not accompanied by anybody else. Obviously, there must be many more who are in some kind of a family or group situation.
Homeless families where the kids are in Chicago Public Schools, we're able to count. So if you talk about 11,000 unaccompanied youth, 20,000 Chicago Public School students are identified as homeless, which means they are probably, many of them, living with their families. So yes, there are more if you count the families, and they are growing. Statewide, the number has doubled. It's 56,000 students who identify as homeless. But has it really grown, or are we just now finally managing to count them? That is part of the question.
And the interesting thing is the economy has gotten a little bit better, but yet the homeless problem seems to be growing.
Well, for young people, the homeless problem is not necessarily financially related. And, you know, there's a gray area. Are you homeless, or is there some housing instability for a few seconds? So it's a very difficult thing to keep a handle on, but it's not always money driven.
All right, thank you very much, Robin. Well, that wraps up tonight's program. You are now in the loop. To learn more about our show, we invite you to log on to WYCC.org and click on In the Loop. For Robin Robinson, I'm Chris Bury.